Thank you, Ambassador Acharya. Nice to see you here, and I want to thank NICE for inviting me to be part of this event and this panel in particular. What I do is try and make three sets of interrelated points in the few minutes that I have. The first point I'd like to make would be about unpacking or disaggregating the notion of Asia's rise. The previous speakers have touched on it, but I want to go into a little more detail on that. Second, associated with the notion of Asia itself and the Asia's rise is the idea of Asian unity that we ought to construct or we can construct. That has been a long-standing notion. So I want to just explore its prospects at this juncture. And third, to look at the presumed tension between Asia and the West. For more than 100 years, these two concepts were seen as in opposition to each other, but I want to just get into that and see how that might play out. First, on Asia's rise, I mean, what seems a fairly simple, straightforward proposition of the economic transformation of our part of the world. But the moment you get a little deeper into it, I mean, I think it reveals a lot more complexity. As Professor Muni said, look, there are many Asias, and the actual definition of Asia has never been settled. And whenever I meet my friends from the Gulf who come to Singapore often, they say, this is my first time in Asia. So the Gulf and the Middle East don't see themselves as part of Asia, although we like to call them West Asia. So when we talk about rise of Asia, really, we're talking about rise of East Asia in that sense. The second aspect is this idea was always been was not just about stating facts, but it had ideas or ideologies associated with the notion of Asia's rise and what its meaning ought to be. So in this question, I mean, I think I would say one, as Ambassador Menon pointed out, Asia did not rise all at one time. I mean, it's been a sequential rise. Japan first, more than almost a century ago, and then you had the Asian tigers, then you have the ASEAN, then China, and then India. Even more interesting, I think, is the fact that that Asia's rise does not mean it is all risen to the same level. That is, any disaggregation of the economic power or the other stuff that you take a look at Asia today, it shows that, look, China's rise has overshadowed the rise of rest of Asia. And we're only talking about East Asia here. For example, on GDP, China's GDP today, around $15–16 trillion, is almost 3 times bigger than Japan's. And China's GDP of $16 trillion is almost more than 5 times bigger than India's, which is around $3 trillion. And these are two of China's largest neighbors. So that tells you the scale of difference. So when we talk about China's rise, it's easy to miss that China has risen faster than the rest of Asia. Rest of Asia has risen too, but China has risen faster than rest of Asia. And that sets up, I think, a context in which China is going to be far more powerful than its neighbors. And I think that will have consequences of its own. And I think that brings me to the second point. But we must be clear that we should not conflate Asia's rise and China's rise. And these are both are facts, but I think we need to look at this as two different phenomena, because one has huge consequences for the other, because the simple association as if Asia has risen without reference to its internal distribution of power, I think will take us in a wrong way. The second, I think, is the notion of Asian unity, which has always been there for more than a century. The very discovery of the notion of Asia, or the propagation of the notion of Asia. Okakura Tenshin, who wrote in 1903, The Ideals of the East, his book began with a brilliant first sentence. That's how anybody who writes books hopefully can find such sentence. It's simply a 3-word sentence. Asia is one. Asia is one. It was more of an idea that Asia was not really one at that point in time, but the idea that, look, there is something common binding the whole of Asia. At least Tenshin was writing about the cultural dynamic. Therefore, we need to think of this region as a single. And I think after that, we've seen extraordinary surge of Pan-Asianism across the region in the interwar period. And the notion that, look, Asia must come together to deal with the West, to deal with the colonial powers, And if we go back, Ambassador Menon would be familiar with the first declaration between an Indian delegation and the Chinese delegation in the Brussels Anti-Imperial Congress in 1927. It lays out a framework that, look, we are going to inherit the world. We are going to get together to transform the world as we gain independence from our colonial powers. But the idea of Asian unity was as elusive as it was appealing, because we talked about an international congress in the Chinese delegation doing it in 1927, but barely 10 years later, they could not agree on how to deal with the Second World War. Because the Chinese were fighting the Japanese, and the Indian National Congress said we must fight the British, although the Indian army was mobilized. But the fact is, Indian National Congress would not extend support to Chinese demand that, look, we should work together first let's do the Japs first and we'll do the Brits later. That was not the strategy of the Indian National Congress, which got into a Quit India movement. So this notion that, look, somehow we can work together just because we are Asians. I think the World War II is such a classic example that already risen power in Asia, that is Japan, made life complicated. Japan was also imperial, and I think that led to all kinds of complications in Asia. And I think that reminds us, it should constantly remind us, one thing to talk about Asia as one, it's another to build actual unity. And for all the romanticization we've done in Delhi about the Asian Relations Conference and the Bandung Conference of 1955, any closer look at the discussion there would show you the deep divisions within Asia at that point of time. And those divisions have not really gone away. And my sense is the ASEAN's rise, if you will, and the absence of great power rivalry in the last couple of decades and an economic integration created, I think, in retrospect, we can say the illusion that Asia is now coming together into a single format. But as China has risen, I think that its aspirations, its ambitions, which Ambassador Menon referred to, will inevitably set a backlash among the others in the region. And you can see, China's quarrels with Japan and India, for example. But not everybody sees that China's rise in those negative terms that India sees or Japan sees today. For example, Kathmandu does not see it in the same way that Delhi does. But then Delhi and Kathmandu are not the only ones. Cambodia and Vietnam don't look at China's rise the same way. For Cambodia, the hegemon nearby, Vietnam, probably is seen as a bigger threat than China. For South Korea and Japan, they don't look at China's rise the same way. So I think there will be differences within Asia of how even to understand the implications of the current rise of Asia and within that China's rise. Third, that brings me to the last set of points, of Asia's rise and the West. That the othering of Asia and the West, has been a dominant theme from the beginning, from the time tensions time, all the Pan-Asian movements that emerged in this part of the world. But in retrospect, if you see Asia's rise, could it have been possible without collaboration with the West? Certainly, if you now look at China's rise and India's own recent rise or ASEAN's growth, have not been independent of the West, because they came out of a single integrated order in which Western capital, Western technology, Western access to Western markets played a big role in transforming Asia. And I think that's a fact, again, I think often not given credit for. And I think Asia's wars, interestingly, the Korean War beefed up Japanese capitalism, facilitated the rise of the Asian tigers. Vietnam War did much the same. And the economic integration after that did wonders for ASEAN and later for India and China. So therefore, this idea that somehow Asia's rise is going to be against the West, I think is problematic, because for all the decline of the West, same time Okakura Tenshin published a book on Asia's rise, a man called Oswald Spengler wrote a book called The Decline of the West. Both these themes then are more than a century old. But the West is not disappeared. It's not going to disappear from Asia anytime. And you look at the numbers of cumulative investment in Southeast Asia, for example. US and the West are still very big dominant forces. They're still an important trade player. So therefore, this idea that these two are different worlds, are going to be different worlds, I think will be mistaken. So both these notions of the West as a political concept and Asia as a political concept, both are very fluid notions. And my sense is they are going to evolve in the years to come. And my sense is that the intersection between the two, that the internal contradictions within Asia are going to intersect with the emerging contradictions between US and China. How this plays out in different theaters of Asia, different countries, different capitals, I think it's going to be the most interesting phenomenon for all of us in this part of the world. So to conclude, I would say, don't get carried away with the notion of Asia's rise. Triumphalism that's been associated with Asia's rise in the last couple of 3 decades, I think has run its course. And today we're going to see probably tragedy, some kinds of tragedies that will follow triumphalism of the recent past. And the even more important, more complexity that we're going to see of the interaction within Asia and between Asia and the West. I think that is going to be the theme of our international relations in the years ahead. And there I would say this is going to leave all of us rather busy understanding and dealing with these profound changes that are taking place of a new relationship within Asia and between Asia and the West. Thank you, sir.